Hello. Welcome. We're pleased you're with us. This is part 3 of our series on Jerusalem, the Holy City in Crisis. As you know, for those of us here at Churches for Middle East Peace, Lent has begun this week, and our focus this Lenten season is on praying for the city of Jerusalem. We thought a good way to launch and to better understand what's happening in the city is to talk with 3 experts. So we talked to Danny Seidemann earlier this week, and then Mae Elise, and now this is part 3 of the series, and we have the great privilege of welcoming Lara Friedman, the Executive Director of Foundation for Middle East Peace. So welcome, Lara.
Thank you, Mae.
We're always pleased to talk with you, and part of what I'm really hoping we can do in our time with you today is to hear from you a briefing of how has this issue about Jerusalem since President Trump's announcement at the beginning of December, how has that announcement made a difference in terms of how's Congress responding? We've been hearing from Danny, we've been hearing from others on the ground, when we want to talk about what that means for us here in the US and the work that we can do here. So would love for you to just start us off. And I'm afraid I didn't tell everyone how amazing you are in terms of your biography. So if you don't know Lara, she's the Executive Director of Foundation for Middle East Peace. She's the former Director of Policy and Government Relations for Americans for Peace Now. I didn't know this about you, Lara, but she was a former U.S. Foreign Service officer who served in Jerusalem, Washington, Tunis, and Beirut, and briefly in Khartoum. I could go on and on about her credentials, but she is absolutely an expert not only on the city of Jerusalem, but on policy and analysis as it relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So lead the way. Tell us what we need to know and what we need to understand.
Well, thank you, Mae. I hope you'll interrupt me as you have questions, because otherwise I will just sort of go off in the direction that's interesting to me. I will add that interesting in my bio, one of the formative people in my experience on this issue is Danny Seidemann, who was one of the first people I met when I served as the settlements officer at the embassy, at the consulate, in Jerusalem back in the 90s. And I learned a great deal from him. So that's been one of the things of the elements of continuity in my work has been working with Danny, who I know you heard from earlier this week. So I will try not to repeat what he said too much, although sometimes I think we share part of the brain. So Jerusalem has been much in the news for those of us who follow Israel-Palestine, obviously, what with the decision of the Trump administration at the end of last year to fundamentally shift U.S. policy. And this was a fundamental shift, no matter how much the administration says, oh, we were just recognizing reality, this doesn't change anything, yada, yada, yada. I mean, that's simply not true. They shifted policy, which has been consistent. It's had different explanations, but this has been, U.S. has consistently refused to recognize any sovereignty in Jerusalem dating back to before 1948. And from the birth of Israel to 67, it didn't recognize Israeli or Jordanian sovereignty in the city. And from 67 forward, it did not recognize Israeli sovereignty in any part of the city. And it didn't recognize it as Israel's capital. So you have a fundamental shift. Whether or not you think that fundamental shift was long overdue or whatever, I mean, the bottom line for a U.S. policy analysis is why would you make the shift now and what does it accomplish? In terms of the arguments for why the Trump administration decided to make the shift now, there's dueling schools of thought, and I work very hard not to in any way pretend that I have insight into someone else's brain. Looking at the way this president makes policy, this is one of the commitments that he made on the trail, on the campaign trail, and he clearly likes to be able to say, I committed to doing this, and now I'm doing it. I said I'd build a wall, I'm going to build a wall. I said whatever it is. So, I mean, he's taken clearly a lot of satisfaction saying, I said I would do this, and I'm doing it, and nobody else had the courage to live up to their commitments before, and I'm the guy who had the courage. As far as a policy shift and what it means for the U.S., aside from the personal satisfaction for President Trump, the question is, what does this bring to the U.S.? And the short answer is, I would argue, nothing positive. I think I wrote a piece entitled "Making America's Middle East Policy Great Again," which this clearly does not. The arguments made by folks around the president, starting with Nikki Haley at the UN and officials here in Washington, included things like, well, this is obvious, this is just recognizing reality, it changes nothing, and the entire world is now going to get on board. Clearly, the entire world has not gotten on board. We saw that immediately with many, many countries, including great allies of the United States, including great allies of Israel, saying, nope, not going to get on board. We had an historic defeat for the United States at the UN Security Council, where you had basically everybody vote against the U.S. The U.S., didn't allow this UN Security Council to take action, but everybody, including our closest allies, were against us on that. And then we had a huge defeat in the UN General Assembly, where the U.S. not only failed to convince people that changing policy on Jerusalem was a good idea for peace and for the world, but after, in effect, threatening the world that if they did not back the U.S., there would be consequences, you had an overwhelming vote against the U.S. policy in the UN General Assembly. And it's even more overwhelming. I got into debates with people on Twitter immediately after the vote, where they said, well, yes, but more countries abstained than in the past or whatever. And, I'm this boring person who really, really believes that facts matter. Maybe I'm wrong. And I did an analysis of the UN General Assembly vote, comparing it to the votes on Israel-related matters over the past year, and comparing it to the last significant vote, the last comparably politicized vote on Israel-Palestine, which is in 2012. And what I found very clearly looking at that analysis was that this vote was in many ways more categorically against the U.S. position and arguably against the Israeli position than we've seen in the past, and showed actually greater cohesion amongst, say, European states. And to the extent that Israel scored some new friends, either with the abstentions or with the votes in favor, these are what I would call transactional votes. These are countries that either chose to abstain or voted with because of a specific economic relationship, or in the case of Guatemala, because you have a specific government that is as right-wing and sort of evangelical dispensationalist in its outlook as this administration, and that's not that's not a policy shift per se, as opposed to an ideological shift there. So the U.S. has failed to get the world to line up in support of this. Nobody else is talking about moving their embassy except for Guatemala. And it's been fun watching members of Congress praising the president of Guatemala, and apparently, making America great again is getting to stand shoulder to shoulder with that is its own set of challenges. Nothing has changed there. What has happened in the background to all of this is that this is a destabilizing move. It's destabilizing in terms of a peace process that was already in mortal jeopardy of losing all credibility. At this point, the Trump administration has now made clear with this move, notwithstanding comments made by people like Acting Assistant Secretary David Satterfield, who is a really great human being and a consummate professional. He was the spokesperson basically around the decision, who said, no, it doesn't mean anything. We're not changing policy on borders. That's to be decided between the parties, yada, yada, yada. And you had Nikki Haley at the same time saying President Trump has taken Jerusalem off the table. And that sentence is now officially U.S. policy. We have taken Jerusalem, which is a permanent status issue, off the table. That right there is the end of U.S. credibility, or at least this administration's credibility, as any potential broker for any peace agreement or any peace negotiations. It's simply not possible. It's essentially the U.S. saying the whole Oslo construct is dead, and we are imposing a new construct where we will dictate, in cooperation with Israel, we will decide what issues are on and off the table. We will decide what range of possibilities for a negotiated settlement are, and the Palestinians can either accept it or not. And if they don't accept it, they don't want peace. That is not a formula for a negotiated solution. That is simply, that's an outright abdication of the U.S. commitment to Oslo and to a negotiated process. So on the diplomatic side, this has been a death blow. And to be fair, the diplomatic process was not in a serious place anyway, but that's where we are today. On the ground, this has opened up a period of sustained low-level violence. For people who said this decision was going to unleash Armageddon, I would just be very clear. Danny Seidemann did not say it would unleash Armageddon. We did not know what this would unleash. Danny was very clear in his analysis, an analysis that I wrote as well, which I looked at Danny as my guru on this. This is political decisions like this that don't directly affect sacred space and threats to it. We didn't know what would happen. That's not usually what sets off an intifada. At the same time, it clearly leaves the tinder much, much more dry and can actually create the situation where you have more and more sparks and the ability for those sparks to light things, whether it's in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem or where the low level of violence that we saw in the immediate aftermath of this decision. At this point, Israel is facing almost daily attacks in the West Bank at a level they haven't seen in a very long time. Can you draw a straight line between the Jerusalem decision and those? I would hesitate to draw a perfectly straight line. Is that one of the lines? The absolute discrediting of the peace process. And by the way, this goes alongside, we took Jerusalem off the table. We now have pressure on UNRWA, which I know you guys are talking about. As I have argued from the beginning, since before this administration even took office, I've been writing about this. Pressure on funding for UNRWA is not about UNRWA, and it's not about funding for UNRWA. It is about trying to take refugees off the table, another permanent status issue. There have been arguments made in this city now for more than a decade, and from Israel, saying that if you just get rid of UNRWA, then Palestinian refugees will cease to exist. We will define them out of existence, and then we have solved, presto, another permanent status issue. So Trump has solved one permanent status issue by taking Jerusalem off the table. The effort is now to take another permanent status issue off the table. In parallel, we have Congress moving, I think today or tomorrow, to finalize the Taylor Force Act, which will remove prisoners as an issue. Prisoners being possibly the single most sensitive issue for Palestinians on the ground. Setting aside politics, diplomacy, or anything else, virtually every Palestinian family has some family member who has been or is in jail, or who has been or is currently detained or has been killed. The issue of funding for families of prisoners and people killed by Israel touches virtually every family. And the idea that there is some solution here which requires the Palestinians to cut loose the families of people who have either been killed by or imprisoned by Israel, and that you could have a viable Palestinian leadership that first loses Jerusalem and has refugees under pressure and is going to give up on prisoners, that's where the political momentum is in this city right now. And that is momentum that is paralleled by momentum towards effectively recognizing de facto Israeli control in the West Bank, where you have a US ambassador who is all but publicly supportive of annexation, and in some ways he is publicly supportive. You have Bibi Netanyahu last week, 2 days ago, suggesting that he's coordinating annexation of the West Bank with the US administration, which was then denied by the White House, but nobody believes that denial is completely accurate. That may mean that Jared Kushner or Jason Greenblatt aren't talking about that with the Israelis. Seems very probable that somebody is. And Netanyahu has other people he talks to, starting with the US ambassador, who is a great advocate for and defender of the settlements. And that is in parallel to actual annexation efforts happening in Israel, which are specifically, first and foremost, starting with Jerusalem and the Jerusalem area, where the effort to annex a whole lot of settlements north, south, and east of Jerusalem and make it a much bigger metropolitan area with a much larger Jewish majority, while gerrymandering out a lot of Palestinians. And on that, while the US administration denied that they're coordinating annexation efforts, there was no statement on the substance of the annexation efforts, whether or not the US has a problem with them. So really, that's where it stands today. Jerusalem, I'm sure Danny talked about this. I was there some months back, and it's always, you go, and I love Jerusalem. I lived there for 2 years. It's my piece of my heart is always in Jerusalem. It is more divided today than it was when I lived there in the 90s. Danny will say it's more divided, I think, than any time since '67. It is the idea that U.S. policy right now is making Jerusalem a more stable, secure place and a more stable, unified capital of the state of Israel is farcical. And I see at this moment nothing in Washington that would act as a braking mechanism on policies that push it further in a very destabilizing direction. And I'll stop there.
That's incredibly helpful. And in a few minutes, we'll open up the opportunity for those watching to be able to ask questions directly. But before we do, I want to go back and try to break down some of the things I heard you talk about. You started out by mentioning that the significance of Trump's decision at the beginning of December was a fundamental shift in American policy. And you even went back, I mean, I hear often, you know, since 67, but you even went back to, you said never, right? Before 1948. Never. That there's been no recognition of status. So in regard to that, of either Israelis or Palestinians having particular status as it relates to Jerusalem, just to finish the sentence. So in that regard, tell us about the decision that Congress made to move the embassy in the 90s. How did that not include recognition of Jerusalem? And what was that decision, you know, as it related to moving the US embassy with the waivers?
Sure. The distinction here is between action by Congress and action by the executive, and it is, for the most part, I would argue, settled. It is a settled matter of U.S. law, as most recently confirmed by the Supreme Court in a case actually focused on Jerusalem, that the whole idea that foreign policy is the prerogative of the president. Under the Constitution, there's something called the recognition clause, I believe. Basically, it's derived from that. The president has the right under the Constitution to recognize ambassadors, or I'm forgetting the exact wording. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. Fundamentally, the way that's been interpreted over the years by the Supreme Court is that foreign policy is the executive. It's the prerogative of the president and the executive. So Congress can legislate whatever it wants, but it actually cannot define U.S. foreign policy unless the president allows them to, which, by the way, presidents often fail to defend that foreign policy prerogative all that well. It's interesting that the most recent confirmation of the president's prerogative did come in a Jerusalem case, and it was something related to the capital of Israel being Jerusalem. You had what was called the Zivotofsky case, which is a case where Congress had passed a law some years back, which specifically said that for the purposes of U.S. passports and reports of birth abroad, people could have their place of birth listed as Israel if they were born in Jerusalem. And the executive, when this was passed into law, this had come up repeatedly under, I believe, Clinton, who always said he'd veto it if it was passed into law because it violated his foreign policy prerogative. It was passed into law under Bush, and Bush issued a signing statement saying it was unconstitutional and that he would ignore it. That one then went to court. It went into court. The court process started under Bush. It finished under Obama, and the Supreme Court, in a case that advocates of Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem, they hope this would be a fundamental change in how foreign policy is made and would empower Congress to do things like legislate on Jerusalem, and it had the opposite effect. Supreme Court said, no, this is the president's prerogative. So if you look at the Jerusalem Embassy Act, this was an effort, I mean, Congress essentially in that had a statement of policy that we recognize Israel's capital is Jerusalem, yada, 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 the embassy should be there. And then because they can't force, Congress cannot decree moving the embassy. So what they effectively did was they said, we have the power of the purse strings, we're going to use it. So we decree the embassy should be moved. If you don't move the embassy, it's going to cost you. And then at the behest of the president at the time, I think it was Clinton, they put in a waiver, which allowed the president to waive the sanctions attached to this law, so that if he was willing to take the hit and say, yes, I know I'm in violation of what everybody wants me to do, but we're not going to move the embassy, he could waive that. During the Obama years, they consistently tried to strip that waiver out. And then here we are today with the president basically saying, I'm not going to need the waiver anymore because I'm moving the embassy.
That's incredibly helpful. And the distinction in terms of whose prerogative, you know, in terms of foreign policy and the role that Congress plays is a very helpful distinction, which then goes, I just want to accentuate, I mean, even my own understanding of the progress of these decisions. The December announcement acknowledging Jerusalem was quite significant, but there at least at that point was some room that, you know, what did this mean? Was it really changing foreign policy, et cetera? But then when you have President Trump making statements like he was at Davos, that now it's taken off the final status, in Jerusalem is no longer a final status issue. What I hear you saying is that this is, I mean, I use the language of fundamental shift. I mean, that's a huge deal.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, question mark.
Absolutely. Look, this was a huge deal from day one. I'm just going to say this outright. I am perpetually baffled by people who still, after a year, seek to parse this president's words to somehow believe that he means something other than what he says he means. Because he tends on these things to mean what he says. If he says, when Nikki Haley said the president has taken Jerusalem off the table, I think that is a much clearer statement of what the president did. And she said that, I believe, the day of or day after the decision. That is a much more meaningful statement than a statement by a very articulate State Department diplomat explaining why it doesn't mean what you think it means. Mm-hmm. This president came being people, this is Jason Greenblatt and David Friedman, who now are also top advisors, and with people like Sheldon Adelson close to him. These are people who have worked for years to change U.S. policy on Israel-Palestine so that the U.S. would recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, so we'd move the embassy, so we'd recognize legitimacy of settlements. I am just continually baffled when people seek to analyze what he's doing to mean something other than what it obviously is that he's doing. It's astonishing to me, particularly after, I have to say, 8 years of Obama, where people continually try to interpret everything he said and did to mean something much worse than what he meant he was doing. It's the absolute flip side. And it's leading people to some very bizarre analysis, starting from the moment Trump came in, when people essentially said, well, you know, he may be unpredictable and everything else, but at least he's being, you know, rational on Israel-Palestine and pretty much keeping up the policy of his predecessors. No, he wasn't. He was never going to do that. And everything he has done since coming into office should have been easily predicted, and was predicted by some of us, based on everything he and his advisors said during the campaign and coming in.
Which leads us to, you know, one of the other things that you talked about was the U.S.'s perspective that this announcement, you know, the entire world would get on board. And one of the arguments for the success of the announcement was the lack of response in terms of violence. So there was significant concern that there might be escalation. You talked about this a little bit and talked about how there's a sustained low level of violence now in Jerusalem. But one of the we talked about earlier this week with Danny was he said, that it's almost like a tipping point or a boiling point. He used the analogy of an earthquake and kind of, you know, pushing the plates closer together in terms of things escalating, and that we need to not misread the signs that because there's not violence doesn't mean that this isn't a big deal. It doesn't mean that violence could be around the corner. Can you talk some about that? Because, I mean, that's one of the main arguments we hear. There's not been violence. It's not that big of a deal.
Look, I mean, I defer to Danny on his analysis of what's happening on the ground. I think I'll probably end up giving you a version of what he said, although I'm not sure what he said this week. I feel bad. I'm sorry I missed your webinar this week. You know, Danny and I and a few other people, I think, were working very, very hard around the time of this announcement to make clear that, you know, we were not predicting the imminent breakout of Armageddon around this announcement. No one knew how it was going to affect the situation on the ground. But in terms of the things that have in the past typically and predictably detonated serious violence, it hasn't been political moves like this that are disconnected from immediate realm. I mean, a statement like this does not, you know, if you're a Palestinian living in Jerusalem, based on Trump's statement, does your life change tomorrow? Do you suddenly have less access to Haram al-Sharif? Do you, as long as Israel doesn't suddenly start allowing prayer on the Temple Mount because of Trump's move, right? The next day, it's the same as the day before. Sun still rises, life still sucks, you're still under occupation, yada, yada, yada. That being said, and this is maybe what Danny talks about when he talks about a tipping point, this is one more factor which is moving us towards a reality in which not only is a negotiated two-state solution, there's no horizon for that at all. But it's a reality where we have, you know, tremendous momentum towards policies which are inherently destabilizing, inherently about zero-sum outcomes, right? Jerusalem as Israel's capital is a zero-sum statement. Trump did not say, and part of Jerusalem will be Palestine's capital. It was a zero-sum statement. It was understood that way by Israelis. And the immediate Israeli calls, you know, for we have to take advantage of this unique opportunity of President Trump to annex more of the borders to Jerusalem, expand the city, whatever it is. I mean, there's a direct line between what Trump is doing here and the emboldening of actions on the ground that are terribly, terribly destabilizing. And there's a direct line between that and other policies which are really about permanently foreclosing any negotiated solution. And you know, it's like seeing different pieces of the puzzle, and you put them together, the picture is very clear, and it's a clear picture of a future that is very unsettled, very uncertain, and almost certainly we're already seeing in the, forget Jerusalem for a second, let's talk about the West Bank again, where we are now having, you know, almost, it's not every day, then it's almost every day we're having attacks. We had 6 Palestinians killed last week. We're on the verge of another war in Gaza. I mean, this is a very, very unsettled situation, and the Jerusalem piece only feeds into that. And let's be clear, Jerusalem is always problematic because Israel has decimated any credible Palestinian leadership in this city. So in the past few years, when we've had these mini intifadas that have bubbled up around the Temple Mount Haram Sharif over and over the past 5 years or so, there's no authority with which to engage to tamp things down on the Palestinian side. It's ended when, you know, Secretary of Kerry goes to Jordan and talks to the Jordanians to tamp it down. Well, the Jordanians, this decision to change policy on Jerusalem puts the Jordanians in a terrible position. I mean, this is a domestic security issue for Jordan, which is the custodian of holy sites in Jerusalem, right? It views itself that way, it's viewed that way, and under its peace treaty with Israel, it is technically that. The idea that Israel and the United States are acting unilaterally to change status in Jerusalem, and then they're going to look to Jordan to tamp things down, that's going to be their only address if things get rough again, is very, very worrying. So, I mean, there's many angles to this. None of them, this does not look good from any angle going forward.
Well, and certainly the lens of the status quo and the shifting realities of the holy sites, you know, the recent attempts to collect taxes on church properties, which historically have not been taxed. I mean, these are things that we have church partners on the ground, a number of them who are deeply concerned about the repercussions, where Christians, you know, who are not our only concern, but certainly a part of our, you know, networks and community and a part of our faith family, where Christians are being caught in the middle, or there's a lot of pressure in terms of some of these shifting realities.
Absolutely. Look, there's clearly an effort here, and this is by Mayor Barkat. First and foremost, what's happening with the churches and UN properties is being led by Mayor Barkat for his own reasons. He's trying to, no Israeli politician ever lost political credit on the right by seeming to be tough on Jerusalem. This is like a surefire thing for political, for mustering political capital, which raises the question, will he on this church and UN property thing end up being supported? Will Bibi end up getting on board and saying, no, I want the credit for it? Or will there be enough outside pressure that he gets pushed back? And that remains to be seen. All of this is also happening to the backdrop of ongoing changes on the ground related to settlements, related to the public domain. I'm sure Danny talked about this. The old city in the Holy Basin has always been a focal point for ideological settlers. This is El-Ad and other groups, Teret Kohanim. What we're seeing right now, and I'm sure Danny talked to you about this, is huge energies being invested in moving projects forward that, even more fundamentally than before, change the patterns of life, the fabric of life in and around the old city in ways that really point towards a zero-sum outcome. And, if a political diplomatic announcement doesn't cause upheaval in Jerusalem, things that involve more Jews trying to pray on the Temple Mount. We still have, it wasn't that long ago that there was a major crisis around the Temple Mount of Haram Sharif because there's such a strong political effort on the Israeli side to change the status quo. And that is still there, and that still has tremendous energy. And Israelis on the political right see an ally in the White House who at worst is not going to in any way object or try to slow things down, and at best will actively support.
Thank you. And we have time for a couple of questions. If people want to let us know, I know there's a number of people watching right now. Before we move to that, Lara, you're one of the first people I've heard, as you talk about the progression of taking final status issues off the table. I mean, I'd certainly heard that about the city of Jerusalem. In terms of the withholding of the humanitarian assistance through UNRWA, the analysis that that's actually taking refugees off the table, why would that be viewed as beneficial? I mean, and we talked with Danny and also with Moen about the repercussions of humanitarian assistance being withheld, and that humanitarian assistance is one of the only band-aids that kind of keeps...
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. The humanitarian assistance, is one of the band-aids that keeps violence at times at bay. But why? I don't understand. I mean, sorry, I'm just...
No, it's fine. And this is the problem, completely immersed in this for years at a time. So when an issue comes up, you actually know exactly what it's about because you've seen it before, but that's because you have years of experience with this. For many years in this city, and I've written about this, by the way, if people are interested, just Google me and UNRWA. There has been a long-standing effort. It's in Congress. We've had members of Knesset come here and make the case. The argument is there is no Palestinian refugee issue. It is a manufactured issue, manufactured by the UN, that if there weren't UNRWA, then Palestinian refugees would long ago have ceased to be they would cease to be refugees. The idea is that UNRWA actively perpetuates the refugee crisis as a tool to use against Israel. And by erasing UNRWA and basically saying kids of refugees aren't refugees, sorry, you're not refugees, and you declare them not refugees, that's done. And by taking the people who you still agree fine, they're refugees, you hand them over to the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, and the High Commissioner on Refugees then uses normal refugee policies to make them no longer refugees. This has been something that has been debated in Congress now for years. The problem with this, fundamentally, is that it's all crap. The UN, to be very candid, the UN High Commissioner on Refugees has 3 ways of handling refugee populations and making them no longer refugees, all of which are unavailable on the Palestinian case because of the politics. The number one option is that you return them from whence they came, let them go home, help them get home. Well, that's clearly not ever going to be accepted by Israel. So best option, not available. Second option is you settle them where they are. Well, if you settle them in places like Lebanon and Jordan, you destabilize those countries dramatically. Those countries will never accept permanent relocation of Palestinian refugees in their borders. It is domestically destabilizing. The UN cannot force them to commit nationalist suicide by accepting refugee populations as citizens. And by the way, millions of the Palestinian refugee citizens are in the West Bank and Gaza. So saying we settle them where they are in a stateless state doesn't resolve anything there either. The third option is that with the agreement of both the refugees and the host countries, you move them to a third country. And that also is not going to work here. Palestinian refugees, by and large, do not want to be resettled in third countries. They cannot be forcibly resettled. And no country is going to take refugees that have been forced to their shores that are irredentist, restive population. So you have 3 options under UNHCR, none of which apply in the Palestinian case. On top of that, the fact is, and someone pointed this out when this debate was first starting with the attack on UNRWA, the Rohingya refugee camps right now, which the UN under UNHCR is dealing with, every baby born there is still a refugee. They don't stop being refugees because they were born outside of the borders of where their parents came from. They are all classified as refugees. So, I mean, this is an old story that is well known to those of us who follow this closely. The fact that it is being treated as we're going to use this to squeeze. I predicted the administration would take this on. I predicted it before they even came on board. This is low-hanging fruit for folks who want to undermine a 2-state solution, undermine a negotiated solution, and it's not anything new at all, and it needs to be demystified.
That is also very helpful. What has been the Palestinians' response in all this, and what options do they have, as these issues, at least according to U.S. foreign policy from President Trump, as these final status issues are being, quote unquote, taken off the table?
Right. So by the way, first of all, on the UNRWA thing, I would encourage people, if you want to look, I've written and published on this for a few years, specifically on this issue of taking off the table. I would encourage folks to look at it. This isn't, I'm saying that because I want to make clear, this isn't a conspiracy theory of me attributing intent. This is the clearly articulated intent of people supporting these efforts to squeeze UNRWA. It's clearly articulated going back for years. So I just want to say that. As far as the Palestinians' options, I mean, I would defer to the Palestinians. I know you had somebody, I'd maybe see if someone from the PLO mission will talk to you. I mean, their options are, you know, I guess there's a creative thinking exercise that has to go forth to say, what are their options? I mean, the Palestinians, from my understanding, everything I've heard, and I would also encourage people to look at Ambassador Zomlot from the Palestinian mission here, did a speech at the Middle East Institute about 2 weeks ago, which is online, and there's a transcript which for me was the most thorough and forthright explanation of Palestinian positions and views that I've heard in 25 years. It's quite extraordinary, and you should look at it. It's very clear that, and we're going to hear from Abbas at the UN very, very soon, the commitment is still there to a two-state solution, although that is so discredited, it's difficult for them to explain how to get there, and I don't know, that's a challenge for them. There's still a commitment to nonviolence. The view that they're still willing to get to a negotiated solution, but no longer see the US as a viable shepherd of any process. And I think that is an incredibly reasonable position. I think any other position would be ludicrous, frankly. Beyond that, they have some cards they can play, which they're clearly choosing not to play. You know, what I call sort of the nuclear options. You know, one nuclear option is they could disband the PA. Say, we're done with this farce. Let Israel and the international community take responsibility for the welfare of Palestinians. We're not going to provide this cover anymore. They don't seem inclined to do that, which is, you know, frankly, a great gift to Israel and to the US. They could, you know, actively seek action at the ICC instead of sort of passively saying the ICC should look at it. They're not doing that either. And the third nuclear option is to actually start joining UN agencies, which they have a right to do. They've had a right to do since 2015. You know, at the point when they start joining, you know, the IAEA and, you know, World Health Organization, it really will put the US on the spot, because US law would force the US then to defund those agencies and potentially collapse the UN system altogether. They aren't playing any of those nuclear options at this point, which seems to indicate that there is a conviction on the leadership side that they still need to look for a diplomatic political solution, and that they are actively trying to do so.
Just a few connection points to some of the work we're doing here at Churches for Middle East Peace. You mentioned Ambassador Zomlot and the speech he gave at the Middle East Institute. We sent that out to our bulletin subscribers a couple of weeks ago. We've sent several of your articles out as well, so people can refer to our website to have access to that information. And as you mentioned, those different nuclear options from the Palestinian perspective, and particularly engaging increasingly at the UN. As you know, Lara is going to be one of the keynote speakers at our June summit called End Still We Rise, and she'll be talking about some of the realities happening. Who knows what things will look like in June. As you're going to be with us, Lara, one of the other speakers who is confirmed is the Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations for the Palestinians, Feda Nasser, will be joining us. And so I'm sure she'll talk to us a bit about what those realities look like at that point. I guess my final question as our time comes to a close, it's amazing how quickly it goes by and how much there is to address. There's been so much happening. What does this mean for us? For those of us who are doing advocacy work, what potential is there for us to, you know, make a difference on Capitol Hill? I mean, what's your perspective about options for the American, you know, Christians, broader constituents who care about this issue? What types of things do you think have potential to make any difference?
Sure. So I should preface this by saying that I'm not engaged in any lobbying or advocacy any longer. At my new perch at the Foundation for Middle East Peace, that's not our role. As someone who's been watching the Israel-Palestine arena for years, look, I think it's very easy to get depressed, dispirited about where things are. But the reality is there is more of a need to engage than ever before. I mean, we say that all the time. You think it can't get worse, but it does. And there's what to do. I mean, I think if you look at some of the initiatives in Congress and around Susia, around military detention of children, we've seen some of these actually get a fair amount of support and actually draw a lot of attention to important things that are happening. On top of that, what you're seeing in combination with the shift, and a lot of this predated Trump, let's be fair, but with the shift in policy on the US side, we are seeing an overreach, I would argue, in legislatures across the country and in Congress, jumping on board with the far-right illiberal approach on Israel-Palestine and translating that to the US side. And here we're talking really about shutting down free speech. And we're seeing that at the state level, these gag laws that are ostensibly about, trying to fight BDS. It's really about gagging free speech. Whether you support boycotts or not, I will say as an American, progressive Zionist, liberal Zionist, I do not personally boycott Israel. I don't call for boycotting Israel. I boycott settlements. I call for boycotting settlements. But I'll tell you, as an American, I'll go to the mat for the right of somebody else to boycott whatever they want. That is constitutionally protected free speech. And as a supporter of Israel, I will go to the mat to stop people from exploiting the Israel issue to take away the free speech of Americans. And that is actually a great opportunity for people to really start defining what's wrong with the U.S. approach on Israel-Palestine. I know there's a whole mixed set of views on this call, I have no doubt. I will say, recently there was a Pew poll that showed this increasing partisan break on Israel-Palestine, and that was really worrying to a lot of Americans who follow this issue, American Jews and American progressives. And, the arguments that were made for why progressives, Jewish and non-Jewish, are increasingly saying that they're not quite as supportive of Israel or not supportive of Israel. And some people said, oh, it's because of partisan, they don't like Trump. And some people said it's because the polling was flawed. And some people said it's because Israeli policies are so off-putting. And there's probably truth in all of those answers. I would offer a third answer. For people sitting in the United States, whether or not they care a whole lot about Israel, when pro-Israel is redefined in the US context to mean supporting illiberal, undemocratic, anti-democratic policies in this country, that is a red line that cannot be crossed. And people are saying, I will not cross it. That's a values issue. It's a values issue for the faith community. It's a values issue for the progressive community. And it's a huge opportunity to stand up and say, this isn't about whether or not I care about Israel. This is about whether or not this conflicts with my core values. And at this moment, standing up for those core values, I would argue, is the best way you can stand with Israel and stand up for peace.
And we've actively been engaged in some of that work. Can you tell us specifically what's the status of the Israel Anti-Boycott Act?
So the Israel Anti-Boycott Act is the piece of legislation pending at the federal level. This is a piece of legislation explicitly designed to criminalize cooperation with what they are calling boycott efforts of the EU and the UN, bearing in mind that neither the EU nor the UN call for or do anything to boycott Israel. The EU has a differentiation policy, which is basically a statement of international law as it applies to Israel and the occupied territories. It's a policy which says, this is Israel, this is not. And if you're doing business in Israel is fine. Doing business in the territories which are occupied can run all sorts of problems, and be aware. The UN Human Rights Council has this database project, which may or may not be dead in the water, but the idea is that they were supposed to and still may produce a database of companies working in settlements in defiance of international law. It's not a blacklist, doesn't prevent anyone from doing business. It's about having transparency. This law would basically criminalize anyone cooperating or basically anyone boycotting Israel or settlements based on what the UN does or the EU does, and it would criminalize anyone who cooperates with or helps that effort. So potentially if I write an article saying, hey, this UN database came out and everyone should hold the companies on this list accountable and refuse to do business with them, based on this law, I could face up to I think it's $1 million in fines and 20 years in prison or something like that. I've written about this. So that's pending. It's still a critical ask of AIPAC. My guess is it will be one of their top asks in March for their policy conference. The backers of it do not seem inclined to back off. There's some talk about amending it to in a cosmetic way say, no, 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 really this isn't unconstitutional. The ACLU says it is unconstitutional. But hey, what does the ACLU know about the Constitution? My guess is it'll be a key ask. The other one, by the way, there's two bills. There's that, and there's the Combating BDS Act, which is also pending in Congress, which I would also expect to be a key ask in the policy conference. And that one is also very interesting because that piece of legislation is about legitimizing and inoculating states who pass what they call anti-BDS laws, which I call gag laws, against any problems. And we already have those laws are now being challenged at the court level by the ACLU. There's a case in Kansas and Arizona. In the Kansas case, there's already been an injunction against the law being implemented, with the federal court judge ruling as emphatically as anyone could possibly rule that the legislation is unconstitutional. And yet, every day almost, we have new legislation being introduced in states across the country. More than 20 states have it already. 2 more introduced legislation this week. I track all of this online because I believe facts matter. But that campaign is not going anywhere, despite the fact we already have one court now saying it is brazenly unconstitutional.
So these, to me, are specific examples of ways that we need to engage and ways we need to be active. And I hear you saying more than ever before, when it seems the most hopeless is when the work is the most necessary, and also that there's some room for us to make a difference. I mean, we were encouraged by the letter that came out, the Dear Colleague letter that came out with 100+ members of Congress calling for the release of UNRWA funding. You know, getting 100 signatures on anything related to this issue, you know, that moves it in the direction we want to, is quite something to be celebrated.
Absolutely. I would also add, I mean, for folks who are out there in the grassroots, I mean, we saw on the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, for example, we saw Senator Gillibrand get off that bill. She had co-sponsored it, and she got off the bill. She got off the bill because, not because, you know, wise, you know, experts and analysts like me gave her, you know, learned analysis for why it was a problem. She got off the bill because constituents called her out on the values, and they called her out publicly. And we saw that with one member in the House as well. You know, it's very awkward for members of Congress who claim to, you know, support the Constitution and free speech and whatnot, when they've got constituents standing up in town hall saying, excuse me, what about this? Here's what the ACLU says. Here's what the, you know, whatever Constitutional Law Center says. How can you be on this? That makes a difference. And you know, we have seen evidence that it has an impact. You know, Americans should feel empowered in this moment to stand up for their values and speak to their elected officials.
And one of our goals is to provide ways and opportunities for people to be able to do so. So we have many action alerts that are currently live. There are 2 that are going to be a significant part of our Lent campaign, because we want to, you know, our Lent campaign is called Pray for Jerusalem. And so we want to enter into thoughtful consideration of this city that is called holy, particularly for us as we go through this Lenten season. But we not only want to pray for Jerusalem, we want to work toward justice. We want to be actively engaged in, you know, addressing these things that we've been talking about today, which are so significantly concerning. So the action alerts that we have that are live, one of them is calling for the release of the humanitarian assistance and the release of that funding to UNRWA. And then we'll have another one that'll come out next week or during Lent that'll come out, which is acknowledging Jerusalem as a shared city for 2 peoples and 3 faith traditions. And we believe a return to that is absolutely necessary if we're going to make any progress and seek to stabilize this city that we call the city of peace. So those are some opportunities for people watching to be able to engage. Do you have any last words for us before we close, Lara?
I don't. I'm very happy you're doing this series, and it gives me hope that you're active and that your constituents are active, and, you know, to the extent that I can be a resource for people, please, you know, please use me, Churches for Middle East Peace. Please.
Thank you. We will be sure to do so, and hope people will come and see you speak when you're with us in June. So thanks so much, Lara.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mae.